Hello and welcome to today's Worksafe Month webinar, Supervisor's Guide to Managing the Injured Worker. I'm Stephanie Morawski from Worksafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I will now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this on the right hand of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's webinar. Questions will be taken throughout the presentation. Please use the questions pane on your control panel to type and submit your questions. Attendee handouts are now also available to download via your handouts pane. These will be referred to during the presentation. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your presenter, Angelina Lee, Occupational Health Physiotherapist from PhysioForward. Angelina has experience in open cut exploration and underground mining, manufacturing, hospitality, aquaculture and the healthcare industries. Angelina is an accredited vocational rehabilitation provider in the Northern Territory with 27 years experience in clinical physiotherapy and over 15 years occupational health. She currently resides in the northwest of Tasmania and commutes to the Northern Territory monthly. Welcome, Angelina.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Penguin Tasmanian area, which I am presenting from, as well as the owners of all the lands to all the attendees across the various states and territories. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So thank you for having me speak today. I think a bit of background on where this webinar was developed might help to understand the information that we're going to provide. So a few years ago, I was involved in a project with a company developing a job dictionary for the various jobs on site. And for those unfamiliar with what a job dictionary is, it will quantify and qualify the physical demands that a worker would have to undertake, as well as what they might have to lift. So for example, it might say overhead reach would be frequent, squatting and stooping would be occasional, and they would have to lift floor to bench 25 kilos frequently. And the reason we developed that document was to support an injured worker through the return to work process by providing that to the medical practitioners that they were seeing, so they would understand what levels this person need to get to be able to return to their regular role. What the downfall was of that was when we went back and after this document was finalized and spoke with the supervisors, we realized we were giving the medical staff really good information on what the workers would do, but the supervisors weren't getting much information at all, or the information that they received they didn't really understand. So this is how it was sort of developed. And the feedback from the supervisors is that they very much know their roles and their tasks. For example, a supervisor boilermaker or a supervisor person of it, seeing department staff. But when they actually had to manage an injured worker, this was something that was completely foreign to them. So we developed this presentation to sort of assist with that, and it's gone on from here. So what are we going to go over today? My screen's not forwarding, Stephanie. There we go. Okay. So we're going to go over the team members and the roles within the various people that are supporting this worker. We're going to try and give some understanding to some of the medical management and the terminology that you might hear and what we mean by that. We're going to look at some timeframes to recovery or expected timeframes, what the responsibilities are for each supervisor, the cost of getting it wrong, and questions. Now, despite having the questions at the end, I generally present this in a face-to-face format, so I would prefer, if you'd like, to ask questions as we go along, and then Stephanie can let me know if we do have questions at the appropriate slide, and I'm sure it's going to be questions that other people have as well. Again, my slide's not forwarding, Stephanie. Yep. There we go. So we're going to start with the thinking point to just get everybody on the same page, and we're going to talk about a hamstring injury. So let's assume that the person's the same gender, they're the same physical fitness level, and they're the same age. Who's going to recover faster? Would we suspect that that would be the injured athlete, a person injured at home, or a person injured at work? And some things to answer this question that I want you to think about would be, how might each case differ in early intervention or medical access or approach to care? So we'd open this up to a webinar poll. So who would recover faster? Go ahead, Stephanie. Would it be the injured worker, the worker injured at home, or the injured athlete? So if you go ahead and want to vote on this quickly.
All right, thanks. So we'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll, Angelina, and share the results.
Thank you. So again, injured athlete, so that's great. That's the normal response that we get for this. So we'll go back to the slides. So let's have a think about this. So when we're talking about the injured athlete, think about what they're doing. They are getting early intervention care. They might have fallen down on the field, and the medical care is there immediately, assisting them and through the entire process. They're going to be supported by their team through the whole process, and they remain with their team. So you'll often see people that are on a team in crutches still attending training sessions or still attending the games. The other important thing about this cohort is they're continuing their activity to the level that they can. So they are, exercising or doing other things, even with their injury. So they might still be going to the gym or exercising as much as they can and maintaining their fitness. Again, nobody marked the person at home, which is generally the case, because whether or not they get in early intervention is doubtful. If it's not a serious injury, we can sort of expect they're not going to get any medical intervention, advice, or rehabilitation. And they will continue their activity levels generally to the point that the injury restricts them. Then we have the worker, and hopefully they're reporting their injury, and we would hope that they would get some early access medical intervention. But with a worker, there might be a stigma of actually putting in a claim and the impacts that it might have in future for them. They tend to also stop any other extracurricular activities that they might be doing, not necessarily because of the injury, because they have the perception often that someone's going to watch them or dob them in, or that their injury isn't that serious. And we also tend to see that this worker would be separated from their team. And the bottom line is, if we have a hamstring injury, it's a hamstring injury, which is a hamstring injury, and we should see that provided we give it the right environment, that person should heal. Okay, I'm still having difficulty forwarding slides. There we go. So why might we expect that this athlete's going to recover faster? We need to think about the different approach for the athlete versus the injured worker. Are we providing them early support, early advice? Are we keeping them as fit as we possibly can so that when they're able to return to the role, they can? We need to think about who the team members are for the injured worker. And what if we started to reframe our injured worker like they were our star footy player that we needed to get them back to win the grand final? Would that possibly change our approach and improve the outcome? And so we need to think about who the workers team is behind the process. So we have various team roles. So the way I put an analogy to this slide is, I think of an injury as dropping a rock into a pond, and you sort of get the ripple effect outward from the injury. So we have the injured worker. Generally, they're going to report that to their supervisor in some format. We hope they report early. Then that's going to expand out to the medical team. And at this tier, we have a group that's providing support and rehabilitation to get the person back to work. So in this tier, we might have a rehab provider, we have the physiotherapist, the occupational therapist, the exercise physiologist. And then from that, and the reason we have the physician in orange is they're sort of the leader of the ship. They will decide where this person goes, what sort of interventions they're going to have, and they support this entire system around the worker. And then potentially out from that, if the injury is serious enough, we might be going to see a specialist physician who generally is going to decide whether or not surgery is indicated or needed. But as a person recovers, we tend to see this draw inward. The physician has done their surgery, so they sort of drop out of the equation. The main physician who's providing the certificates may only be seeing this person monthly because they're not changing, week to week. We have the physiotherapist, the OTs, exercise physiologist that may be seeing the person 1 to 2 times a week. And then we have the supervisor and the worker. So as the injury recovers, it sort of draws back into that. So the question now, and next poll, is which team member out of that group is the most important relationship with the worker? So is it the supervisor, the injury management advisor, the therapist, the exercise physiologist, the physician, or the specialist?
We'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll, Angelina, and share the results.
Great. Absolutely right. So the supervisor has the most important relationship with the worker. In that team, if you think about it, who's the person that the worker knows prior to injury? It's only the supervisor. And research is showing that that relationship between the supervisor and the worker will greatly determine whether or not a worker will go back to work, which sort of deflates me, I suppose, as a physiotherapist, thinking that I'm quite good, or we might get them to the best physician or the best exercise physiologist. But what's the most important is the relationship between the supervisor and the worker. All right, if we could go back to the slide before with the tier of the team. There we go. So some things to think about in this. You're at the middle tier, I suppose, and you can think about that as your middle person, your middle man. You have your rehab provider, which may or may not be external to your organization. It's really important that they're your communication point. So they're communicating up that chain to the physician and the physios, et cetera, and they're communicating information back to the supervisor and the worker. We need to make sure that in this process that even though we're surrounding and we're supporting this worker, that they don't become a passive participant in the process. They need to be very much active and engaged in the entire process. And we need to make sure that we don't over-medicalize a claim. So if we're getting multiple people, different approaches, and multiple messages given to the worker, that's really important to minimize so that we're all providing the same message. So different information can kind of confuse the whole process. So communication for all parties is the most critical issue. And again, your injury management person would be the person, hopefully, that will communicate up and down the chain as the middle person. Okay, we'll progress to the slides again. All right. So understanding the different roles of the different people and, again, the need for communication. So your physician or your specialist is going to refer for all the treatment. They're kind of the leaders of the ship. They're going to tell the person what investigations need to be done and send them potentially off to a specialist, and they will generally name that specialist specifically. Saying that, the worker always has the option to see their own physio or a person of their choice or the specialist of their choice also for a second opinion. They're going to also provide those ongoing worker capacity certificates that come through, advising what the person can and can't do and what their restrictions are. Now, saying that, in some states and territories, they are starting to allow other professionals that are qualified to do certificates. They have the physician do the initial certificate, but the follow-up from there is sometimes other providers such as physios, which I think is well structured, and hopefully the uptake improves on that. Because we're generally the ones, or the people that are working with the client are generally more aware of what their capacities are, and we provide that information back to the doctors. And we have the time also generally to test that based on the demands of the role. Your injury management advisor, your return to work coordinator, again, may be in your business or your company, but they also may be external. And it's really important that they understand your business and the different jobs and tasks that are associated with that business, so they can communicate both with the supervisors and the medical providers. They're also the people that might take the job dictionary along with the worker to the appointment, so that you could assist with determining suitable demands that are within your organization. They develop the return to work programs, and they will hopefully attend, and if not, update and facilitate some of the appointments. So a lot of times they will go to the doctor's appointments and then give us an update. Again, us being the entire team that's supporting the worker, so we're all getting one form of communication back and we know what's happening. Your physiotherapist, your occupational therapist, and your exercise physiologist, their real job should be building capacity to return to full duties. So they need to know what the person needs to be able to achieve to return to that work. They're going to be doing the clinical treatment and the rehabilitation, and generally, like I said before, they're providing some information back to the doctor on what the worker's capacity is at the moment. Now, as supervisors, you may be getting worker capacity certificates that are coming back, and you continually see this 10 kg restriction limit. But you know that if this person could be increased to 12 kilograms, they could do all these other potential tasks out on site or within the office, etc. So if you know that one parameter, if we could improve on that one parameter, would change and give you more ability to find different tasks and move this person closer to doing their role, that's really important information to give to the injury management advisor, or even to the physio or treating providers if you're in a working relationship with them, because that will be the entire focus that we could provide to get this person back to work early. So it's also helpful to understand the clinical process. We use a lot of sometimes medical terminology, and as long as we're on the same page and using the same terminology, it's helpful. So you'll hear a lot of times us talking about conservative management. And what's that? Well, conservative management means that a person is improving according to what we expect them to improve. So we don't need to do anything necessarily heroic. We don't need to send them off for studies. It's settling. It's doing exactly what we expect this injury to do. And we would generally follow that over the course of 4 to 6 weeks. If, however, conservative management plateaus and the person's not getting better, or pain or other issues are concerning, that might trigger us to then do some more investigative studies. It's really important, I suppose, though, to understand that this is the first point of call. We don't want to, again, over-medicalize a claim. So it can become very unhelpful if the worker's going back to work and they're hearing from all their colleagues or cohorts, why haven't you had an MRI? If you have a back injury, why haven't you had an MRI? Because then that puts pressure on them to kind of go back or question the whole system. So if they haven't had one, they probably don't need one at that point in time. So that's a good thing. But again, like I said, if they're having ongoing pain or other sorts of issues, then that might trigger us to move forward and get some more studies done. In the medical community, you'll also hear us use we'll go back a slide. Yeah. In the medical community, you might also hear us referring to something called red flags. And red flags to us means there's something more sinister going on. There's a disease process going on in the background, or actually the cause of these symptoms, which could be something like cancer, some sort of inflammatory condition, diabetes, some sort of neurological condition. So generally, we would be referring on immediately because we would recognize the flags for this. And the outcome for that worker is not necessarily going to be the best one, because they may find out they actually have a disease process that's going to take them out of work for a period of time that's not work related, and therefore they're not getting compensation. However, we do hope that they are going to return to work. So keeping communication with this worker so that when they do recover from whatever's going on, they can return to work. Then you'll also hear us use the term yellow flags. So yellow flags are outside stressors. They could be a workplace conflict. It could be that the person's being performance managed at work prior to this injury. It could be that the worker has these beliefs that they're never going to get better. They may have some underlying mental health issues, and then this injury's kind of triggered that off a bit more. They may have this fear of having this injury because their brother or their parents have had this injury before or something similar, and they have had a poor outcome. Or they may just be having some issues adjusting to injury. Again, as supervisors, you have that most important relationship with the worker. So you may find this information out, and sometimes providing that information to the injury management advisor and providing that up the chain can help us to support that worker more. For example, if we needed some counseling or some support for this worker because they're going through a particularly difficult time, it may be completely unwork related, but sometimes having the discussion with the insurance company, and they will support some counseling services without prejudice, which means we haven't created the issue, but we're happy to support that because they know that if we provide that support, we can get this person back to work earlier, and that this issue is actually causing issues with their injury. So more information, again, shared around maintaining confidentiality is really, really important. Now, we do further studies, investigations, MRIs, CT scans, etc., but what's the risks associated with that? So have a think for a moment. Why might we not want to necessarily jump to an MRI at the very beginning of an injury? And hopefully the answer is, one, that we might find something that's completely unrelated to their injury. So I'll give you an example. If we took 10 people off the street that have never had any low back pain and we put them in an MRI machine, we would suspect that about 6 of those would have a disc bulge. Completely pain-free, asymptomatic, not an issue. But if we show that up in the injured worker, they may feel that that's related to their injury, and it takes a lot of explanation to tell them that that's not related to their problem. The second risk that we could have is potentially that we find nothing. And if we find nothing, they can feel very invalidated because they are having pain or they're having these symptoms, but nothing's showing up on the scan. And it becomes most unhelpful if they return to work and they're asked by cohorts or supervisors, how did your MRI go? And they go, well, it didn't show anything. And you go, oh, well, I guess you can come back to work then, there's nothing wrong. So it's very important to kind of reframe that. Well, I guess it didn't show up anything, but that's a good thing. So we know there's nothing sinister going on, and now we can expect your recovery to kind of continue with the rehab that you're getting or the support that you're getting. So very important on how you frame your comments. Cortisone injections. Now, for those of you that don't know, that's a very strong steroid injection that's used as an anti-inflammatory to different joints generally or tendons. We do them for 2 reasons. So one is evaluation. So we inject the area and the person that was having pain in this tendon is pain-free for 2 minutes. Well, then we've confirmed that that's the source of their pain. We do it also for therapeutic benefit, hopefully, which means it's going to last for about 4 to 6 weeks and actually manage and reduce their pain. So say you have a worker that's had an elbow injection and they come back to work, and that was about a week ago, and they're going, I'm completely pain-free, I can do everything. And you're wondering to yourself, well, why aren't we increasing their duties because they're not having any pain or they haven't had any pain for 2 weeks? Well, hopefully in the background with their physio and their different rehab, they're being built up somewhat so that after that 4 to 6 weeks, if we haven't had any sort of issues, we might be a bit more conservative in increasing their duties over that period of time. because we definitely don't want to exacerbate it and have the cortisone only last for a couple of weeks. So hopefully that makes some more sense why we might be a bit more conservative in upgrading their duties too quickly, even though they're pain-free during that period of time of recovery. And then referral to a specialist, we're really only looking for a specialist if we're looking at probably a surgical opinion or some sort of treatment that's going to require that treatment. All right, we can move forward on the slides. Yep. So when we're looking at timeframes for recovery, if you think about a tissue having good blood flow to it, it's going to recover faster. So when we're looking at muscle, we're looking at probably that 4-week mark if we have a muscle tear. But if we're starting to look at tendon or ligaments, it's going to take a longer time frame. They don't get as good blood flow, so you can be looking up to that 12-week mark or that 3-month sort of period. Then we get the older workforce, and a lot of times when we're seeing scans or different things come back, you'll see the word degenerative. That doesn't necessarily mean it's broken. Sometimes it can be a normal process of wear and tear, and that in itself can create angst. But if you think about something that's not at the full capacity because it has degenerated somewhat, we're looking at a management, not a fixed. So with management, we know that maybe that structure is never going to have the full capacity that it used to have. It will always be a bit less or a bit more vulnerable, if you will. So it's really important to teach the worker other strategies and ways to perform the task safely, and that should be part of their rehab process. And the other thing is we try and build up the capacity of all the good structures that are around that one so that it doesn't get loaded up too much. If you have a broken bone as far as a work cover claim, I'll tell you what, that is the easiest claim that you're ever going to have generally, because the worker can stand in front of you, they can show you the x-ray and point to the spot that's broken. There's no invalidation there. We know that the bone's going to connect over that 4-week period, and then we're going to have increasing strength over 12 weeks. And part of the references that we have in there, they actually show that the broken bone, it's very quite straightforward. But I'll explain the next sentence a little bit more through that broken bone scenario. So most injuries will heal better, stronger, and faster with gradual loading instead of rest. So I had a gentleman that had a pretty severe forearm fracture, and he was a manual laborer, pinned and plated, etc. And he was gradually being increased in duties. And when we did a repeat x-ray, a few weeks after he'd been the bone had been broken, we'd seen a little bit of callus formation, but generally not what we were expecting as far as, the bone sort of knitting or growing back together and reforming. So we went back to his workplace and we said, gosh, is he doing, these things based on his certificate? And the answer back was no, it was such a bad break. We've actually put him into office duties. He's not doing anything manual. He's not loading it up at all, which was the reason why we're getting such a poor sort of union or knitting. So there's a reason that we do increase capacity on the certificates. So it's really important that we are increasing that capacity and those activity levels in the workplace. Because that wasn't occurring in the workplace, we had to put him into scenarios of doing lots of push-ups and different things to load the bone, so that when we did a repeat x-ray again another 4 weeks down the track, we actually showed good knitting. So it's really important. There's a reason why we're increasing the certificates. We're building the structure, we're building the capacity of the structure. So just putting them in light duties until they get a full clearance isn't necessarily helping them to the best of their recovery. Employer influencing factors. We need to reframe it again, going back to that injured athlete scenario. So we're talking to the worker in ways of, we need to get you back to work because we need you here. You're a valuable employee. What can we do to sort of help you get back? What are we missing? Checking in with them and seeing how that surgery went. So that's what we mean by the early and ongoing positive contact with the worker. We don't want the first call to the worker to be after they've been off work for 6 weeks. And I suppose that's one of the biggest points to make as a supervisor and worker interaction, is that the initial comment that a supervisor makes when the worker comes into their office injured is very critical. So if the initial comment has been, oh, this is all I needed to my day, I can't believe this is happening, I can tell you that every time that worker comes into physiotherapy, that is what we're hearing about, because they're really upset with those comments. And I don't think we're all expected to be perfect. You know, sometimes we do say things that come out a bit wrong and we realized, you know, later that wasn't what I should have said. But that comment needs to be remedied at some point in the return to work process. If not, it becomes a real sort of thorn that festers in the whole scenario. The other thing that comes to play is whether or not the worker has been checked on while they've been away from work. So you'll hear quite often, I've worked for this company for X amount of years, and I can't believe that nobody's bothered to call and check in on me. So as supervisors and employers, the two biggest things you can get right is your initial response to that injury and calling and checking in on them. So that's that early and ongoing positive contact with the worker. Realizing that this worker has all these people around him that are strangers that are telling him what to do. So as the worker's coming back, we need to make sure the supervisor and the worker are engaging in that return to work process. So what does that mean? Sometimes it means giving the worker some ownership of what tasks they can do. They're the person that's most familiar with their job. They are familiar with what their restrictions are, hopefully, because they've had that input. So having them sort of develop a return to work program with tasks that would be suitable for them. Now, if that's already been generated for you through a return to work coordinator, as supervisors and workers having that discussion, you might actually find that there's other tasks that the person could be doing that hasn't been listed on that page that would be helpful. And again, feeding that back so that that can be included in their process. We need to match the capabilities with the workplace in something that's meaningful and ideally something that's associated with their role. If you can't find something within your area and you have a big enough organization, then you might think of how you might be able to share their expertise and their knowledge out with a different department so that they can still stay with the same sort of group in general, but they might be working in a different area for a short period of time until we can get that capacity up so they can return to their team. We need to think about providing the environment for the worker to return to work. And for a moment, I want you to think of what I mean. When I say provide the environment, what would that be? So initially, we tend to think about the physical environment, and that's really important. So do we need to put any sort of structural modifications in? But that may be, you know, thinking of where their desk is. If they're still on crutches and their desk is a long ways or up the stairs from a toilet, you know, do we need to re-engineer that and put them closer to the toilet? Is the door for the toilet really, really heavy? So for them to get through that with crutches, they're probably going to be taken out or knocked over. Where do they need to go to interact with their staff, you know, or other staff? You know, could we set them up on a telehealth so they don't necessarily need to travel or get to this other area? So we need to think of the physical environment, but we also need to think about the emotional environment for the worker, their colleagues. And one of the things that becomes very difficult for workers is when they have little comments made from their coworkers about, oh yeah, you're putting it on, or you're you know, how much longer are we going to go with this injury? That really becomes very unhelpful. So making sure you're wording up your staff and the other people around them that that's not appropriate, or having some discussions with HR for those staff members that are not helpful. And wording up your team if your worker's been away for a while that they're going to be returning, and you know the expectations of providing some support to this worker when they come back on Monday. We also need to provide the environment for worker to adhere to restrictions, and that's easier said than done. It's very difficult for a person to say no to a coworker when they come up to them and ask for them to. They will generally do it even at the expense of knowing that they shouldn't be doing that, or that's, you know, outside of the scope of what they have on their restrictions. So you need to think about how we're going to give this person permission to say no. Sometimes some supervisors have had their worker explain to the rest of the crew that they're with or their coworkers about what their restrictions are, and then that way you're not breaching confidentiality. And the worker says, you know, I'm not supposed to be doing these things, and then the rest of the team can sort of hear that and provide support. Or if they see also the worker then going outside that, they could go over and say, can I help you out? For more manual labor, sometimes we're actually pairing that worker up with a TA or an apprentice, because the worker has a lot of knowledge and they can sort of talk someone else through it, but they always have someone there to do the physical component of the task. Then we also need to think about sort of any workplace accommodations. You know, do they need a specialized chair? Do they need a different desk? So a sit-stand desk now. Are they going to need some sort of breaks? Where and how are they going to take those? So what are the supervisor responsibilities? Well, we expect you to check in daily with the worker. That goes without saying, seeing how they're going. And again, you're the big communication point in the workplace. So if things are not going well, that needs to be communicated up the chain so those restrictions can be changed, or if they need an earlier appointment with a physio or the doctor, etc., that needs to be communicated. We need to assure that they have time to comply with their rehabilitation program. So a lot of times you'll see that the person needs to take a break every 20 or 30 minutes and go for a walk around or a stretch. They can sometimes manage that themselves, but if they have specific exercises or stretches, we need to take into consideration, where are they going to do those? Are they expected to do them in the middle of everybody else with no privacy? Or are they able to go into this room that they can use between this time and this time that would adhere with their restrictions? You know, so thinking about those sorts of things. I know sometimes at mine sites, you know, they might be doing stretches, et cetera, and they'll go down to the medical center. Well, how far away is that medical center that they might have to walk to get down to do that? You know, would it be better to do it in a room or an office closer located to their normal work area, but again, giving them some privacy. Now, the gym programs, they can be a bit tricky. So you need to check with your organization to see how you want to manage people that need to be going to the gym as part of their rehabilitation. It's up to you on whether or not, as a business, whether or not you want to let them do it in work time or outside of work time. But I'll pitch an idea to you and you can see if it works for you. So generally on people that have restricted hours, they're not back to their full hours, we're trying to build them up. We're trying to build their endurance so they can tolerate more. So I would suggest for that cohort, you're looking at letting them go to the gym outside of work hours so that we can use that extra hour that they do the gym twice a week or 3 times a week as a building capacity to return to full hours or full duties. However, when you get a worker that's doing their full hours and they also need to go to the gym, sometimes acknowledging that they've had to take a lot of their personal time to do their rehabilitation, to attend appointments, etc., and saying, look, this isn't going to be for long term, but I'm happy for you to go to the gym on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can knock off work an hour early, or you can come in an hour later, you know, so manage it so that it works still with your workflow, but it's also giving them time out of their work time, if you will, to go to do these things to improve the compliance with that. And one thing that I find with gym is sometimes we give people gym programs and it's a real important process for them to get better. But this person has never been into a gym their entire life, so it makes them very uncomfortable. So to go at knockoff time between 5 and 6 o'clock, if any of you guys have ever been in a gym before, it's jam-packed with people that generally know what they're doing and can be very, very intimidating. So you need to think about, you know, if you're actually letting them go and come in a bit later or knock off a bit earlier, they may be going at a time where the gym's not as attended, and so they're not going to feel so uncomfortable attending that, and they're going to be more compliant with that. Down to compliance, so we need to assure that the worker is complying within their restrictions. And how do we do that? Well, that may be some discussions, again, with the co-workers prior to them starting so that they're aware of what the restrictions are, and speaking with the worker and going, you know, really shouldn't be doing that. These are the things that you can do for today, especially if we're exacerbating the injury. We definitely don't want to do that. And communicating, again, we expect you to communicate any sort of issues, problems, concerns up and down the chain. And you might have some concerns that, you know, that you would need to go to HR to. You might have some concerns that, you know, relayed up the chain can improve our care for this worker. So you might get the most information back from this worker if they're unhappy with someone that they're working with. And when we go back to the team, you know, the physios, the doctors, etc., You might find out from the worker that they've seen 4 different physios and they have to go through the history of their injury each time they go to physio. Well, that's not going to be the most conducive to helping them get back to full duties. You know, consistency is going to be better, or they're seeing lots of different physicians in the same practice. But again, you know, one's guiding them in one path and one's guiding them down another. So if that's an issue, you know, sometimes speaking with the rehabilitation coordinator saying, is it possible that we can get one consistent person to see this worker through the entire process? It just becomes more easily facilitated, I suppose. All right. How do we improve outcomes? I think at the beginning we could all identify that early intervention is key. So ideally we want some sort of intervention within the first 24 hours, and we don't necessarily want that intervention to be Dr. Google. And you'd be surprised at how many workers that I talk to, they're like, oh, I looked this up, you know, I shouldn't have, and I think this is what's going on, and they'll be completely off base, and the information that they're going by is not going to help their process go along. So, you know, if you have a medical person that's around, so getting that, you know, that first aid, if we can get early physio assessment for advice and mobility and that doctor intervention, that's great. So the more we can do for them in the first 24 hours to give them good advice, expectations, and how to manage it, it really reduces a lot of anxiety. Because of COVID, telehealth has boomed, and it's something that's been around for ages, but obviously the uptake has been much better, and it's nice that it's actually being funded now by different models, including Medicare, etc. But I want you to look into telehealth services, especially in Tasmania, Northern Territory. You know, people are in remote areas. It limits the amount of travel that they need to do, and that might be your option on how you're going to get that service within the first 24 hours. Ideally, you're going to want a service that provides some sort of OC health sort of background so that they're giving that sort of information. And, you know, if you know a physio that does that locally that also works with your business, and a doctor locally that works with your business, that makes that early intervention really easy because they're familiar with the roles on site. Early treatment is key. You know, reporting niggles before they become an injury is always what I stress. So, you know, that might mean that we just go out and we see your workplace, and we make some workplace modifications or changes to your desk or your seating system. It's amazing that you go out and you do one tweak to a chair and the person goes, I can't believe the difference. It doesn't hurt anymore. And we can then teach the person to manage it themselves. So if they share a station with someone else, they can modify their chair each time that they go in. And then they can realize the cause and effect scenario and be more mindful of that. Sometimes it's just short-term task modification. We've irritated something, and all we need to do is stay away from these few specific tasks for a few days, and it's going to settle. Again, we need to just create the environment for the tissue or the structure or whatever we've injured to heal. And if we do early treatment and early intervention, we can identify the trigger for better long-term management. So again, a niggle instead of an injury. It's very difficult when someone comes in and you say, how long has this been going on? And they go, oh, a while. But now it's just gotten to the point where, you know, it's really bad and I can't do my work when I go to work. And you go, well, when did this start? And you go, oh, maybe 3 months ago. And you go, okay, was it this month? And they go, no, I do remember having it around Christmas. And to try and find what actually caused the problem can become very difficult. So if we can identify the trigger early because they're coming in for early advice, then we can help to manage it much better. If a worker is off-site, it's really important that you call to check on the status. Now, if that's not something that your business has normally done in the past, it's probably worth wording up the worker. I'm going to give you a call in a week's time just to check and see how you're going, so they don't have anxiety seeing that their boss is calling them to check in and see what's going on. Okay. Yep. We'll go to the next slide. There we go. So how do we improve outcomes for our workers? Well, we know early return to work is key. All the research shows us, and we've known this for years, the longer that a person is off work, the less likely they are to return to work. So it's really important to find tasks and different things that they can do. But we have to, getting them back to work, we have to consider what the medical issues are, you know, how often are they going to need to attend, whether we can accommodate that, especially if we're working at a remote site. We need to think of the psychosocial context of that. For example, you know, there may be family issues that are happening at home that it actually makes it better that this person is at home to try and support the family than being away from work. So we need to be aware of that and provide support where we can to enable that person then to return to the work. And we need to think of the contextual factors at work, you know, the workflow, what they can do, what their other skills are, what their knowledge base is. So if you have a job dictionary associated with your business, that's great, because then you can go and look at the physical demands for various tasks that this person might do and duties and weights associated with that. If you don't have that, then you need to be sitting down and going through different tasks that this worker would do during the day so that you can find something that's suitable for them to do. Now, despite what your workers and people will tell you, by getting people back to work early, we actually have less pain, stiffness, and swelling. Now, how can that be the case? Well, you can think about it. If you have something that's painful, you generally tend to notice it as you're going to bed or at night. You really, really notice it because you're not distracted. You know, you can focus in on that pain. So imagine what happens if you're sitting at home and you're not working, and that is the main focus of your day. We actually can grow nerve endings and more nerve endings so that we're actually more focused on the pain, or we can feel it much easier with much less input. And we don't want to get into that scenario. So getting back to work, we actually have less stiffness and swelling because generally they're moving and managing and hopefully walking around. As a physio, a lot of times we're going over joint movement. You know, we're trying to get more movement, and they'll come into the clinic and we get an extra 10 or 15 degrees, which is a lot sometimes. They go back to work and then they come back to see us and we've lost all that movement. So it's really important that they're using, again, if it's an arm or a shoulder functionally, they are starting to do those reaching tasks because then they're using it. If they're sitting in front of a desk and they're not going back to those reaching tasks that they did before, then sometimes we can lose it. And as a physio, you know, each time they come in, it's almost like Groundhog Day. We get the 10 degrees, they go back, they lose it. So if that's the case, we need to be teaching them something else to maintain it. But work is really important to maintaining that movement as well. Depression, you put someone outside of their family, and I do consider work as a family because we spend so many hours there. You know, there's a high incidence of depression. So the longer the person's off work, the more that can affect mental health. If a person's off work for a long period of time, they also have quite a bit of anxiety about return to work. There's been quite a few cases where they've had stress before they've gotten on a plane or hopped in their car because they've been off work for such a period of time. So making that phone call, saying that you're expecting them to come back to work and you're ready for them, is a good thing to do. The longer they're on work cover, there can become financial implications. I won't go into the details of that. The longer they're on work cover, it definitely has an impact on home relationships. So you start to see relationships deteriorate and marriages break down at about that year mark if it's been under work cover. And there can also be a real sense of isolation because they're not with their work community. Okay. So you'll hear a lot of times us saying suitable tasks. What are suitable tasks? Well, they are productive. They're purposeful, they're within the restrictions, and they're something that hopefully the worker generally does as part of their role. Very important, because if you put a worker in a back room that's not an office worker, they feel demoralized, they feel like they're being punished, and they feel like it's very demeaning work. So try and use the person's knowledge base and the skills as they're able to. Okay. So I tease my supervisors and I say, you know, if we get it right for one case for this year, we've paid for ourselves, and that's definitely the case. So going over some of the costs. If you have an early intervention case, and that means it's not going to a claim, they might get a few sessions of physio, some medications, may or may not see a doctor. There's not going to be any increase in premiums because it didn't go to claim, but this is only for very, very straightforward cases. And if you have a good team around you that knows your business, you're looking at less than $1,000. As soon as we talk surgery, including the rehab afterwards, we're talking easily $60,000 to $80,000. If you have a basic claim for no surgery, about $20,000. Here's where it comes to the shocker. Any sort of long-term claims that you look with a year onward, each year you can factor they cost about $100,000. And that's because the person at that point is seeing multiple specialists. They're getting independent medical reviews requested by the insurance company, all the ongoing treatment that they're going, and the costs sometimes of travel associated with that. There's significant costs to the worker, to the company for other staff and training. Insurance premiums go up. So for some of the businesses that I work with, the feedback from them is for every dollar they spend this year, it can increase their premiums to $2 next year. Saying that, work with your insurance companies, because a lot of insurance companies, especially for bigger organizations, have funds that they will provide an organization if you're doing something to manage or mitigate or improve your injuries and reduce your injuries. So sometimes there's some proactive programs that can get funded by your insurance companies to actually reduce your costs associated with them. And then there's cost to society, especially for long-term pain and relationships and those sorts of issues as well. So there is a big cost when we don't get it right. And you'll know those cases, the cases that will linger in your mind that you're going, oh, what did we do wrong? And that's really important, I suppose, as a business entity to go back and go, what could we have done better in this case? What did we not manage, and learn from those so that we can provide the support to the workers for the future claims. The last poll, how do you feel this webinar might influence how, or do you feel this webinar might influence how you or the business that you work for manage an injured worker in future?
So I'll close the poll shortly, Angelina. I'll close the poll and share the results.
Yep. Yes, maybe, no. Okay. So a couple of things to think about. If you can take one thing away from today, I think that's important to change your processes. If there's anything that you've gotten out of today, have a look at that. Even if it's one little bit of information, I think that can be helpful. The other thing, when we talked very briefly about suitable duties, and we can open this up to questions now if there's any questions, there was a worker I had that would never make it through a full work week, even though he was cleared for, doing some modified duties due to pain. And he came up to me one time and he said, I'm actually going to stay back the full week this time because this department has asked me to do this task and it's really important to them. And I know it's going to cause me a bit of pain and discomfort, but it's a really important job, so I'm going to stick around and do that. So it just goes to show that your worker will really, really bend over backwards to work with you, provided you give them something that they feel is meaningful and not necessarily in the back office shredding paper. Are there any questions for us, Stephanie?
All right, thank you, Angelina. So if anyone does have any questions, please type your questions in the questions pane on your control panel. And Angelina, yes, a comment that has come through which you may wish to respond to. Some doctors put workers on medical certificates without understanding the working environment.
Absolutely. So I think that's where your injury management advisor going to the appointments, or someone, a representative from your company going to the appointments, to sort of explain that and advocate for, we can find some suitable duties for this worker to do. We have light duties that are appropriate for this person to do. As long as they have capacity for work, we can find them something to do. And it also stops the scenario of a person actually being certified unfit for work when they do have capacity to do different duties, when the doctor doesn't know that. And I think it's well worth, your while, if you do have injured workers, to know the doctors around your area that will work with you and your business to support this worker getting back to work.
Thanks, Angelina. Another question, are there, or is there any data about the potential actual reduction in premiums with an early intervention approach?
Not that I've seen that has been published. I've seen some data from different organizations that I've worked with, and it has reduced their premiums, but it's not something that they have put out for the general public or put in as far as research projects go. But that has to be very, very carefully managed, and I've generally seen businesses that do that actually get a very good return to work program process in place before they even start to look at the early intervention. That's something that sort of they start looking at when their processes are very good. It's not something that is a starting point.
Thanks, Angelina. And there's still time to submit questions for today's webinar. And just to remind everyone as well that Worksafe month runs throughout October. So do head to the Worksafe Tas month.com.au website to see what other webinars we do have running during Worksafe month. So the following is not a question, Angelina, but it is just a comment that this has been a really interesting webinar with some good nuggets of information to take away and to implement with my managing team.
Fantastic, that's great feedback. And nuggets, I think, is the word that I was trying to search for before. If you can get any nuggets from this, that just sort of triggers processes that you might be able to do to improve your systems, that would be great.
Thanks, Angelina. And then just to end, again, great presentation and thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you all for listening today.
So thank you, Angelina Lee from PhysioForward, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Supervisor's Guide to Managing the Injured Worker. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate you providing us with your feedback. Today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available at the end of Worksafe month on our YouTube page. On behalf of Worksafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania Board, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Angelina.
Thank you.